بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله المفتوح والصلاة وتم التسليم على سيد محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. We're beginning today, inshallah ta'ala, line number 16. We're just going to cover 16 and some of 17, inshallah ta'ala. Now, this chapter, as I mentioned last week, is related to more to spirituality, or what can be derived from this chapter is kind of spiritual lessons, especially related to our state currently with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our relationship with the Messenger of God alayhi salatu wasalam. But what he tries to do is highlight, or what he attempts to do in this chapter is highlight or give caution in relation to kind of the whims and the desires of the self, and how that prevents essentially our relationship with God and our relationship also with the Messenger of God and the Sunnah. Line number 16 is very interesting. Most of this class will be based around that particular line. And that is the following, that Imam Busiri states, مَلِّ بِرَدِّ جِمَاحٍ مِنْ غَوَايَتِهَا كَمَا يُرَدُّ جِمَاحُ الْخَيْلِ بِاللُّجُمِ, which translates as, who can hold back my headstrong soul from the error of its ways, just as wild horses are restrained with bridles and reins. Now, this is a line that I'll dedicate, inshallah, most of the session to, and talk about different things. The import, or what we can take away from this line, I'll begin with the hasil and then I'll continue on from that, is that he's kind of talking about the underlining, or rather he's complaining about himself. And we talked about the nafs al-lawama last week, that who is there that can help me control this nafs of mine that's out of control, and to control it as a horse when it's bolting, when the horse is bolting, how it's pulled back by its reins by its owner. Who can help me in that way? And we're going to talk about kind of the reason that he uses that form of tashbih, that use of simile, specifically in this line. But before that, I've told the story before. I don't think I mentioned it last week, but I'll begin with the story of Sheikh Ahmad Allawi, the famous story about Sheikh Buzidi and the snake. And that is that Sheikh Ahmad Allawi, when he who died in 1936, the great Algerian sage, when he was a teenager, maybe late teens, I would assume, he worked as a cobbler with his friend, and they had a small shop, and a sheikh came to visit. And at that time, the story is quite long, but he was to some degree a snake charmer. He would catch snakes and charm them, and the sheikh asked him to do that in front of him. So he said, I looked for most of the day, I think, or half of a day. For a snake, I found a small one. I brought it to this sheikh. He didn't know at that time that this was the great Sheikh Buzidi. He just thought somebody that his friend knew that just had come to visit the shop. And the sheikh says, charm the snake. And so he charms the snake. And he says at the end of it, does it matter about the size of the snake? He said, no, if it's small, big, it doesn't make much of a difference. A snake's a snake at the end of the day. I can charm any size. And then he said, there's a snake that if you could charm, there's a particular snake, and if you could charm that snake, if you could control it, then you'll be the saint or the sage of this era. And he asked what that was, and he said, it's between your two shoulders, meaning your nafs. If you can control that, then you'll be a great man of God. So this is an interesting kind of story to begin with, of Shaykh Ahmad Allawi. And it relates to the line quite a bit. Now, I want to talk about the various commentaries and what they say about this line, because they're very interesting. Ibn Ajiba begins, and he writes about why the simile, how does the nafs compare to the horse, or the bolting horse. But before we get to Ibn Ajiba, Imam al-Ghazali states, talking about the nafs when one is in a state of complete overcome by shahwat, that it's easy to push the horse into the stable, meaning at night time when the horse needs to rest. It's easy to push it into the stable, but it's much more difficult to pull the horse out by its tail. And the idea is that once one enters into a state of shahwat, it's very difficult to stop that at that point. That's why measures need to be taken, and preventives need to be put in place. What do they say? Prevention is half of the cure. So Was it 9/10 of the Quran? Now, Ibn Ajiba writes that, very interestingly, he writes, when a horse bolts, and I saw a video the other day actually, it's quite interesting, where I think they were Americans, and their horse had just run onto the road, and it was just riding, and they're driving, trying to catch up with the horse. Eventually, they do catch up with it, and they control it. But whilst it's running, it's very difficult. And even Ajiba writes, with the owner of a horse, they can catch up with it. You can control it at a point. Why? Because it can be persuaded by the owner. The owner can persuade the horse eventually at some point to stop running. However, he writes that the nafs, there's no stratagem in place to bring the nafs back. He writes that it's only divine grace, tawfiq, ilahi, divine grace that actually allows the nafs to come back. There's nobody that can just drive it back immediately. And then he adds some other points as well. However, the other commentaries see it differently, or slightly differently. Ibn Maqlash has a very good entry on this, and he writes that something wonderful actually. He writes that this simile of the horse and the nafs is there because one who rears horses, owns them, looks after them, nurtures them, nourishes them, trains them. If the owner of the horse is good, it feeds it well, it brings it with love and consideration, it doesn't harm the horse, then the horse will be very good. It will obey the owner. But also the owner will be kind of known then, or will have achieved, you could say, a rank of somebody who knows how to train horses well. It's a good trainer. And he writes the human being is the same thing. That if our nafs, we taught it well, gave it good tarbiyah, and I'm going to talk about internal mujahada in a short while, about can you do it yourself, or how does it work? And the nafs is trained properly and taught good akhlaq and manners, etc. Then it will be obedient to the abd, to the person. It'll be obedient. It'll obey the abd. Whereas if you don't do that, and you let it just have what it wants, spoil it, as Busiri says later about spoiling the nafs. كم لذة للمرء قاتلة كم لذة حسنت للمرء قاتلة. And you spoil it, and it will eventually destroy the nafs. So that's Ibn Ajiba's, Ibn Maqlash's take, that you could say that a person who, every human being is like an owner of a horse. That the horse, imagine that to be your nafs. Bajuri, also interestingly, takes another tact. He mentions the generality of the verse first, and then goes into this idea that if you look at the verse, he comments, he says at the beginning, Malli bi raddi jimahin. So he asks a question, and that question is, who is there? Who can hold back my headstrong soul? So is there somebody that can? Is he calling out for somebody? Or is it merely rhetorical? Is he saying, please help me, there is somebody there? Is he talking to himself saying, who is there? Nobody can control you. Nobody can control you. And he infers from this line that he writes that the nafs requires an external presence, i.e. the nafs can only be controlled, not controlled, but the nafs can only be trained, I would say, trained by somebody who is external to the nafs. That is not the person himself. Maybe, and he quotes, he looks at the idea of a sheikh, the idea of a person who can train another. A spiritual sheikh, you could say. And I want to kind of discuss that because that's the context of not only his commentary, but also the commentary of Kharputi. And I want to talk a little bit about Sidi Ahmad Zarruq's take on that as well, or some things related to that. Bajuri is interesting because the wording, and Bajuri is a late commentary. It's not an early commentary at all. It's a late commentary. So although it's a good commentary, I prefer some of the earlier ones. And he writes that وفي هذا البيت إشارات إلى أن السلوك لا يتم إلا بشيخ عارف. That this line infers or indicates that suluk, and suluk is this idea of training on the spiritual path, this idea of developing on the spiritual path. لا يتم إلا بشيخ, will not be complete except with shaykh عارف, with a shaykh that is arif, arif meaning one who knows God. Why? And he gives a reason for that. لأن النفس, because the nafs, the ego, the desire, the kind of the lower self, ربما تستحسن أمرا فيكون الهلاك فيه. Sometimes the nafs beautifies a thing, but yet it's destructive. And we all know that that's the case for all of our nafs. Sometimes we make excuses, or we do beautify certain things, or make excuses that I need this particular thing, when we know we don't need it, but we convince ourselves that we do. فشيخ العارف كالطبيب الماهر, and the sheikh is like a very intelligent doctor. He's like an expert practitioner, you could say. So that's his kind of conclusion to the line, his summary of the line. But that needs to be unpacked. Why? Because there's so many important things in it, and I wanted to spend a bit of time on that, because Kharputi's entry is very, very interesting. Although this lesson will be quite short, it'll be up until Maghrib, and I'll take questions after. I think this topic is quite important, and I do want to tackle it, especially in light of what Kharputi states. Now, but coming back to the horse example, the reason that simile is so important, there's a rule of the rhetorical device tashbih or simile has been employed, because it's تشبيه صفة الشيء بما قاربه وشاكله من جهة واحدة وجهات كثيرة لا من جميع الجهات. Remember, to strike a simile, you only need certain things that are found in both things. And human beings, Kharputi later quotes, that they have the animal side. This is very, very important. And I mentioned it last time that we have the angelic dimension, but we also have the animal dimension, the bestial dimension within us. The problem is that often takes over, and this kind of era, the materialism we live in, we have been overtaken by that form of, or that part of our makeup, that human beings have just given into their desires, such that the Messenger of God said, I mentioned this last week, that the day of judgment will not come until sins become most irrelevant to people. They don't see them as anything big anymore. I.e. the idea of desensitization of sin, that is, and that's of all things. And because we live in that era now, and the example of that is how people just reacted to this whole virus when they began to hoard stuff and become very rude and violent towards each other, shows that there's a predominance of the animal element of the human being over the spiritual, angelic dimension of the human being, which is slowly, if not entirely, disappearing from us. Now, Sheikh Kharputi mentions, and this is what I want to focus on here, his quote about this whole idea. He writes that Busiri, firstly, he writes that he's advising or talking to himself, and he's saying, إصلح نفسك بالمرشد الكامل لأن المرشد له إرشاد. So he writes that discipline your soul, or correct yourself with a guide that is a complete guide. And the job of the murshid is what? To شاد كل من استغرق في الهوى. Somebody who is kind of overcome, drowning in self-desires, the murshid realigns him. There was a saying of a saintly man in Turkey, and he said, give me a man from the village, I'll make him a salih, I'll make him a man of God in 40 days. Give me somebody from the city and it will take more than 40 years. It's a very interesting idea of it all, the whole idea of hawa, low kind of debased or desires, when one gives into them, is when one's trying to rectify. It depends where you are on the spectrum. The lower you are, the more work you need. The lower you are. And one thing that I definitely have seen is this idea of pretense of words. The Messenger of God said in the hadith narrated, Imam Barzanji mentions it in his Signs of the Hour, and the Messenger of God is purported to have said that the Day of Judgment will not come until the zuhud becomes a riwayah. The abstinence from the dunya becomes a story that people tell each other. And then he continued and he said, piety becomes something pretentious. So when you hear this kind of very spiritual language from people that doesn't in any way state what their actual internal states are, and Kharpouti further affirms that, how would one know? One thinks the majority of sinners may be actually good people, and the majority of good people may be sinners. But then he asks a very, very important question. He talks about this idea about taking the means to become spiritually better. And he quotes Abu Yazid Bistami, and I really want to unpack this quote because it's very common and very, I believe so anyway, my understanding of it misused. He says, قال Abu Yazid al-Bistami, Abu Yazid Bistami, Bustami, was a famous Sufi that was known for his many quotables he has, and known for many stories related to him about spirituality and about zuhud, abstinence of the dunya or from the dunya. He says, "Man lam yakun lahu shaykh fa shaykhu shaitan." This is not a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, even though some try to attribute the Messenger of God that whoever does not have a shaykh, his shaykh is shaitan. Now it could never be a hadith because the word shaykh was not used in that context anyway in the time of the Messenger of God. Now whoever does not have a shaykh, his shaykh is shaitan. Now interestingly enough, this is always used by people trying to make, like, purchase murids or purchase students. It's used by them to encourage people to kind of submit to them or become their spiritual disciples. Now he continues and he mentions a few other things, and he says this may be indicated in the verse of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَابْتَغُوا إِلَيْهِ الْوَسِيلَةِ, that look for a intermediary to God. Look for something to help you reach God. A wasila, an intermediary. That this could be one meaning of that look for pious people to benefit from, however you place them, if they're spiritual kind of guides or not. Now, very interestingly, now he brings up the topic about why Busiri doesn't mention that. Why doesn't Busiri mention Malli bi raddi jimahi min ghawayati kama yuraddu jima'ul khayli bil lujumi? He's directly talking to himself. He's almost saying there is nobody. Malli, who is there that can, help me control my nafs? There is nobody. And he writes a reason he states that is because it only comes, as Ibn Ajiba confirms as well, as we mentioned earlier. He says, وَلِأَنَّ نَفْسِي فِي الضَّلَالَةِ, my nafs, misguided, in this state of misguidance and rejection, فَلَا هَادِيَ لَهَا إِلَّا اللَّهِ, that there's only Allah that can guide me, only Allah that can help me. And there's a narration Kharpouti mentioned, al-Burda وَلِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ هَادٍ, that what about the narration that there's, for every community there's a hadin, there's a guide, there's somebody to guide them? What about that? Meaning, is Kharpouti arguing for the seeking of a spiritual master, or is he actually saying it's only Allah that guides and look to seek from God and men they're incomplete? Well, he qualifies it, and he mentions something quite interesting. Kharpouti, remember, is a long time ago. He's not somebody that was born in the 80s or the 90s, 80s or 90s. So what does he say? And he talks about this idea of what was going on in this particular time, and it more so applies now, to be honest with you. He writes that, yes, we agree that every qawm does have a hadin, does have a guide. لكن وجود مثل هذا الشخص is, meaning the existence is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allots or places in the world. Only Allah can exclusively place in the world for mankind. And then he bemoans the state of affairs in this particular time. And the reason I want to mention this is because nowadays we have a huge problem with where do we take spirituality from? Where do we take it from? You've got a group of people over here that's saying come to my place, I have a sheikh, come to my sheikh. Another group of people saying, come to my sheikh. Another group of people saying, you don't need any sheikh, you can do it all on your own, you just need to watch, go and watch YouTube videos, things of that nature. Or there are other group of people saying, forget men altogether, just read what's in the books. There's another group that says, read what's in the Quran, follow the word. People are incredibly confused about this. Principally, we all agree that spirituality should ideally be taken from people, i.e. people who have experienced different states of affairs, people who have got through that and managed that and have a close relationship to God. Number two, people who have ilm, knowledge of the book and the sunnah and the early masters of spirituality, and how to overcome those. And people of Asian experience as well. So I don't think there's anything disputing that. The problem is, how do we recognize that? And Kharpoti writes something quite interesting now. He documents the following. He writes that وَقَدْ الْأَمْرُ فِي هَذَا الزَّمَانِ إِلَى أَنَّ مَنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ فَرِيدًا قَطُّ يَدَّعِي شَيْخُوخًا وَيُجِيزُ بِهَا, that people in my era, he's talking a very long time ago, who are claiming spirituality and claiming to be spiritual masters, he writes, and they have no special quality, nothing. And they are claiming shaykhuha wa yujizu biha, and giving ijaza to other people. Yeah, the kind of frauds, charlatans, and the prevalence of them. He writes, why? What brings them to their claim? He writes, لِانْتِشَارِ ذِكْرِهِ وَشُهْرَتِهِ وَكَثْرَةِ مُرِدِهِ, because this person has become famous, and his name is spread. Intishari dhikrihi, people, everybody's hearing about the person. وَكَثْرَةِ مُرِدِهِ, and this person has many followers. So that negates, of course, we know that followers don't mean anything. The more followers you have, that doesn't mean the greater you are. In fact, the more followers often deludes people. Many of the sages have talked about this idea of followers. There's a story of Bayezid Bistami, very interesting story. He was somebody who just kept away from people, and it was Ramadan, and the story, Allah knows best its authenticity, but the story is quite wonderful, and we can still take a lesson from it. It was Ramadan, and he left his home before Fajr. And because he was traveling, he wasn't going to fast. And he walked through the marketplace, and people began to follow him. Said, Bayezid is going on Umrah. He was going to Umrah, and Bayezid is going to Umrah, and let's follow Bayezid. What on Umrah it will be to be with this pious man. So people begin to come out of their homes, getting ready. And before you know it, he has a group of people following him. And he begins to feel a little something in his nafs. And immediately he takes an apple out of his bag and he begins to eat it. And the people, they run away from him. They said, Bayezid is a fasiq. The month of Ramadan, he's eating food. What kind of spiritual man is this? Unbeknown to them, of course, that he's not fasting. And then he feels much better. He walks away on his own and he heads towards Umrah. This idea that the nafs can be disturbed is such a thing. Furthermore, the Prophet ﷺ said, and this quote by Sayyidina Umar as well, that to praise somebody to their face is like cutting your brother's throat. And he was very, very careful, Sayyidina Umar was, of anybody praising him. Why? Because he knew how the nafs reacts to that. And we should also be kind of cognizant and wary of that, of how we can be deluded by our own false sincerity, that we assume that, oh no, we're being humble when we're using certain words or saying certain things. So he continues and he writes that they claim this state because they become famous. وَقَدْ جَعَلُوا هَذَا الشَّأْنَ الْعَظِيمَ اللَّعْبَ الصِّبْيَانِ وَالضُّحْكَةَ الشَّيْطَانِ, that this has become a joke now. It's become like a playground for children, meaning this shaykhuha, this everybody is a spiritual sheikh. He said it's just become a playground for children now. In fact, he uses those words. He said, لَعْبَةَ الصِّبْيَانِ, it's like a plaything for children. In his period, in his time, imagine now. But then he adds to that and qualifies even further. He writes why. He says حيث يتوارثونه وإذ مات واحد منهم يجلسون ابنه مقامه صغيرا كان أو كبيرا يلبسون الخرقة ويتبركون به وينزلون منازل الشيخ فهذا مصيبة قد أمت. He says an example of this is when a sheikh, maybe a real sheikh, he passes away and he places his son on his seat, if he's young or old, and he dons the khirqa, the robe that his father had on once. He dons that robe. And وَيَتَبَرَّكُونَ بِهِ, and takes barakah from يَنْزِلُونَ مَنَازِلَ الشُّيُوخِ, and he becomes a sheikh. And by this, now if you look now, take the subcontinent for instance. Subcontinent is full of this. The Messenger of God said in a famous hadith, Sahih, at the end of the hadith, the wording is, right at the end of the hadith is a hadith that's quite long. I mentioned it in my lesson on the Quran. That he whose a'mal slow down, they stop, they procrastinate over their good actions, their nasab, their lineage will not speed it up for them. Meaning, just because there's a saying in Farsi, Pidram Sultan Bood, that, oh, my father was a sultan. That doesn't make you a sultan. My father was a wali. It doesn't make you a wali. My father was a sheikh. It doesn't make you a sheikh. In fact, the ulama have a famous saying that very rarely do the children of shuyukh become shuyukh. Very rarely. And that's why if you look historically, very rarely do you see great ulama and their children being also great ulama as a rarity. Often it misses a generation, like Subki or Ibn Rushd, and then the grandson is. And maybe then it just disappears. Maybe one of the hikam, the Messenger of God, ﷺ, none of his children survived him that were boys. We don't know the true hikam of that, the wisdoms of that, because the al-Bayt hold a massive status in our. But the Messenger of God again, the status is always given at the highest level to taqwa, and even al-Bayt for that particular period, we could consider Sayyidina Ali, for instance, to have had the highest of taqwa. He had the two elements. He had the connection, lineage connection to the Messenger of God, but then great taqwa as well, both of them. He had both of great status. Now, he continues to write that this now has become a musibah, almost a tribulation in our time, qad amat. And then he mentions his final point. He says, وَلَعَلَّ هَذِهِ الطَّرِيقَ قَدْ تَمَّتْ وَانْدَرَسَتْ آثَارُهَا وَاللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَالَمْ بِأَخْبَارِهَا. He writes, it seems that this is finished now, this whole system. Yeah. He says, Allah Ta'ala A'lam. Now, so what do we do there? I would argue that he's 100% right, and this applies even more now. It's very rare that in that kind of system, that system exists anymore. We have people sitting on seats that are frauds, people who are merely public speakers and are followed just by impressing other people through their speeches and through that kind, and people are buy into this idea that they're spiritual masters, and then you find them being then those people falling, and masses of people, droves of people leaving them. What is the answer? Imam Sha'rani says, and he complained about the same thing in his time, that actually that he mentions a few things that in the absence of a spiritual master one should do. But before I touch on Imam Sha'rani's quote, there are still many pious people. That doesn't take away from the fact that pious people still exist. And company with those pious people, here's one right now. Company with those great pious people is wajib alayna. Imam al-Ghazali says that one of the 4 diseases of the heart is keeping bad company. So keeping company with good pious people is definitely, as Ghazali states, first look for a spiritual master, and they are rare in my time, he writes. This is in the 600s. Number 2, if you cannot find one, and it would be very difficult to find one, then look for a good friend. Have good good company, have company with good people, have a good friend, and a good friend is somebody who tells you when you're wrong or there's a problem and he recognizes that. And number three, right, if you cannot find that, keep your ears open to the rumors that your enemies spread. For indeed, enemies don't make things up from nothing. Often enemies will take something that's true and exaggerate it. That what's true within it, take that and learn lessons from that. That's what Imam Ghazali states. He quotes Ghazali here, but that's for a different topic. Now, Sidi Ahmad Zarruq mentioned something quite similar as well. He writes that in his Qawaid al-Tasawwuf, in his rules of spirituality, that, so Imam Sha'rani said, sorry, going back to Imam Sha'rani's point, that La ilaha illallah, kathratu la ilaha illallah, that constantly saying La ilaha illallah, and kathratu salawat ala nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, kind of filling our lives with salawat upon the Messenger of God. But however,
I got this. Oh, what did he do now? Dragon, baby dragon. It's go scare me.
He's not qualified. So, like I said, I've met many spiritual people, great people, sat with them, benefited from them. So great spiritual people still exist. What we're talking about here is a specific idea of claim to spirituality by charlatans. How difficult it is to separate true money, real money from fake money, essentially. So Sidi Ahmad Zarruq also comments on this to a degree, anyway, and we can take some benefit from what he's talking about. That the fuqaha of Andalus, from the later fuqaha, they debated about this idea that do you need to follow a teacher? And he gives some interesting answers. And he breaks the shuyukh into three types. The Shaykh al-Ta'aleem, a teacher that teaches you religious knowledge. Shaykh al-Tarbiyah, somebody who disciplines your soul. And Shaykh al-Taraqi, who takes you one level beyond that. And he writes something quite interesting, which I did like, one of his quotes in there. And this is the first point I want to talk about. He writes, فَالتَّقْوَى لَا تَحْتَاجُ إِلَى شَيْخٍ لِبِيَانِ وَإِمُومِهَا. Number one, that there's no reason, taqwa, knowing about taqwa and having taqwa doesn't require a shaykh. Although that's not in context of his whole quote, but the point is true. But he does write, وَالْإِسْتِقَامَةُ تَحْتَاجُ إِلَى شَيْخٍ. This is one opinion that they gave, returned, of these ulama that debated over this question. وَالْإِسْتِقَامَةُ تَحْتَاجُ إِلَى شَيْخٍ فِي تَمْيِيزِ الْأَصْلَحِ مِنْهَا. Some of them said that istiqamah, being steadfast, does require a shaykh to differentiate between two things. Is this one good, or is this, I know these two are good, but which one's better? Which is a better method for me to take? He kind of infers, and right at the beginning, he talks about how the shaykh must be somebody who follows the sunnah. فَلَازِمَ الْإِقْتِدَاءُ بِشَيْخٍ قَدْ تَحَقَّقَ اتِّبَاءُ بِالسُّنَّةِ. Follows the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ وَتَمَكُّنِهِ مِنَ الْمَعْرِفَةِ. So he agrees in principle that spiritual masters are needed, but how difficult they are, he argues, or the ulama argued, that the previous ulama mentioned at Kharputi, to find and to keep company with them. And how dangerous often it can be also, falling into the hands of a charlatan. And that goes back to our original line of Busiri, that who is Busiri talking about? Man li bi raddi jimahin min ghawayatiha. Who can hold back my headstrong soul? We said ideally the first standard and level is somebody of spirituality that can help you and aid you in that. But if that cannot be found, and even that's placed, we said, by divine grace. He continues, and the section Imam Kharputi, I'll try my best to finish this line. And he writes and finishes the chapter. And he quotes a narration that your nafs, and I've heard this from other shuyukh as well, that the first obligation for a person is that they control their nafs themselves. That the first obligation, the first martaba, and Sidi Ahmad Zarruq talks about this as well, is mujahadatul nafs, is to have mujahada or control over your own nafs. We move to the next line, inshallah, for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and introduce the next line. فَلَا تَرُمْ بِالْمَعَاسِ كَسْرَ شَهْوَتِهَا إِنَّ الطَّعَامَ يُقَوِّي شَهْوَةَ النَّهِيمِ. Imam Busiri in this line moves on to some of the things that destroy the nafs. Okay, we recognize that we need to correct the nafs. But what is it that harms the nafs the most? Historically, the Sufis and the people of spirituality have always put as one of the central problems or things that affects the nafs, they placed food in that category. Do not aim to break the desires by plunging further into sin. فَلَا تَرُمْ بِالْمَعَاصِي كَثْرَ شَهْوَاتِهَا. If you all remember the story of Rasputin, for instance, who believed that one will be emancipated from or will be forgiven through sin. The more sin we commit, we will be forgiven through it. And if you know the story of Rasputin, he's quite a violent individual. And then he writes, إِنَّ الطَّعَامَ يَقَوِّي شَهْوَةَ النَّهِيمِ. The glutton's greed is only increased by the sight of food. يَقَوِّي شَهْوَةَ النَّهِيمِ. The Messenger of God ﷺ said in a famous hadith, it is sufficient for the son of Adam to eat a few morsels of food that will straighten his back. But if he cannot do that, then he should have one for food, 1/3 of his stomach for food, 1/3 for liquid, for water, and 1/3 to breathe. Not only that, Imam al-Ghazali in his famous book, and I recommend that everybody get this book, this particular book on disciplining the soul, he lists it as one of the central desires from the two desires of the soul, breaking the two desires, kasra shahwatain, from his ihya. And he has documented kind of huge kind of chapters to that idea. Furthermore, Imam Junaid is known to have said, and others were such as Sariya Saqati, that the early Muslims were people who found great levels of spirituality through fasting and hunger. Imam Malik is known to have said that one should never eat his fill. He should always leave something there that he feels hungry. Now, all of us here, me myself included, we have an inclination towards food. We overeat sometimes, of course we do. We overeat. But if we did and truly follow the Sunnah method of eating, then none of us really would have many underlying health problems. I want to introduce this topic by looking at some of the statements of different people, as Kharputi lists and Ibn Ajib and others, about what food does to people. But I want to mention some ahadith of the Messenger of God ﷺ, to introduce the topic. Firstly, the idea of fasting, how fasting breaks the desires of the nafs. The Messenger of God and the Sunnah method for fasting is all in all 5 days in is 3 days in the middle of the month, and then 2 every week. And if you add them all up, you will have some crossover for some of them, especially if Ayyamul Bid fall on a Monday and Thursday. But you're talking approximately 1/3 of the month, the Monday, the Thursday, and the 3 days in the middle of the month. Interestingly, the 3 days in the middle of the month, Ayyamul Bid, which are 13th, 14th, and 15th of the lunar month, some of the ulama suggested that the reason that they have been singled out by the Messenger of God ﷺ is due to the fact that a desire, one's sexual desire, is heightened in those 3 days. Allah Ta'ala alam, I don't know the truth of that. If anybody's done any surveys related to how many people commit zina at that time, but they say it's heightened. It could be, it may not be, Allah Ta'ala alam, but it is sunnah to fast in those 3 days. If one wants to do more than that, the Messenger of God said that what they call Sawm al-Wisal, the Sawm of Dawood, which was to fast every other day. As for perpetual fasting, the Messenger of God didn't recommend that, and that is to fast every day. And in fact, the Sahabi did that, and later he found, I'll finish on this point inshallah for this weekend. The Prophet ﷺ later told him 3 days, but then he fasted more, and then eventually fasted every day. And then he said he eventually became quite ill and unwell. And he said, only if I had taken the first advice of the Messenger of God, that he felt fasting every day was too much for him. We'll stop there for today, inshallah. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لي ولكم وأتوب إليه ولسائر المسلمين.